Hello, everyone. Um, my name is Michael Plettner, and I will show you some very important stuff around anything else, or just anything else except voice. Very technical stuff when you start to migrate from Skype for Business to Teams. So just a short introduction for myself. I'm doing Microsoft 3C more than 12 years. I've stopped counting there. I've done Microsoft 3C projects from OCS, Links, Skype for Business, Teams, and all the stuff with voice in global organizations, with enterprise voice, without enterprise voice. And I founded my own company a couple of years ago, hosting a Teams user group in Munich. And I've recognized that Teams is just more than the voice stuff, the technical stuff about voice. So we've changed our company purpose to this for change management and digital workplace transformation. That's also the reason why I will talk about the current topic with you. So that's the agenda for today, and I will just give you a quick introduction what the differences are between communication and collaboration. I will give you some insights about the fundamentals from Microsoft Teams to maybe think on another way how to start a Teams project, how to get involved in Teams projects, and also give you some insights about what's necessary from the governance, from a security perspective, talk about some challenges on different perspectives, and I will talk about telephony and voice stuff as well. So why is it necessary to talk about all this stuff? Typically, a project comes along with one purpose. So, for example, someone said, "Hey, I would like to get rid of my old PBX or from my Skype for Business on premises, and would have heard something about Teams." And that's awesome. Or from another perspective, I just want to collaborate with other colleagues in other countries, as a part of the company, and just want to use Teams because I've heard it's much better than Skype for Business, the current tool we use. Just insert a name here. But in the most of these cases, no one really knows what the differences are between the communication and collaboration tools. So when you start from the voice perspective to get into a Microsoft Teams project, then you start with your own focus on voice. So we have heard some really great sessions with technical background stuff from Randy, network stuff from Linus, and those things have to be considered for voice, but communication is just one part of Teams, and communication is always between a single person or two persons or a group on a direct way. Just work and send information on a specific way. On the other side, collaboration is working on ideas, work together to achieve a target, to create something. And in the most cases, it's working on something specific and everyone just joins the creation process. But that doesn't mean there's a communication between those creators. That's the reason why Teams came in. And just to clarify some really basic stuff, if you're not aware of this, Microsoft Teams has Office 365 groups behind them. So Office 365 is a specific type of group which is used for additional services in Office 365. For example, Planner. And it's also used for Teams and Yammer and a couple of other tools. So that's one really, really important point to understand in the very beginning. Office 365 are underlying multiple apps and services in Office 365. Start to think about what's necessary from the services perspective to implement, and does it make sense to use the same group, or doesn't make sense to use the same group for additional services like adding a planner plan to Microsoft Teams, for example, or vice versa. If you create a team in Microsoft Teams, there's a SharePoint in the background. So you have to consider, is SharePoint the way to go for my data? And if it is, because I have to when I use Microsoft Teams, is it maybe necessary, or do we have to clarify which type of data shall we use or shall we store in SharePoint in this case? So for example, if you are a company which is working with the CEO level or C-level from companies and talk about some very top secret stuff, allows your policy just to store this in SharePoint Online right away, or maybe you have to consider something more, which I've covered in the future part about governance and security. Also, there's a huge connection to Exchange. The messages are currently stored in Exchange that will change in the future, but you also have to think about, does it make sense to move my mailboxes from on-premises to the cloud and save some storage local on-premises and use services which are already available from Microsoft and used for so many customers. Are there other workloads in the cloud? So do I have another tool from Google or another tool from a third party in the cloud? For example, something I can get rid of when I move from on-premises to the cloud. So if you use Trello, for example, this is a planning tool. You can replace the Trello with Planner, for example, and that's something you have to think about. Don't implement multiple tools for the same purpose. One tool, one purpose in the cloud. So it doesn't make sense to move it over here. And I've mentioned it before. Please think about governance. Governance is the key factor for all the Office 365 and cloud projects which come along. I've seen a great quote on a T-shirt which said, Teams is king when governance rules. And that's the best description for all the stuff around Teams and cloud services, especially for Teams. When you start with a project, with a Microsoft Teams project, you also have to think about lifecycle management. Because it's easy to create a team, it's easy to create a team for every user. But what happens when this team is not in use anymore? What happens when you just start to finish your projects, which have maybe stored in Microsoft Teams. And what happens with the data? Who is responsible for clean it up in the background? Remove users. All the stuff is really important to think about and maybe recreate some lifecycle processes. Another point is onboarding, which is pretty straightforward. You just have a new user or a new employee in your company. You start with the very basic stuff, an AD account, that's fine. Permissions, that's good. But what's about Teams permissions? What about mailbox in the cloud, on premises? What's necessary? Is it necessary to provide a headset as a user about to make calls with Teams? And how can I get a user the headset? And what about training material? So when you start to onboard someone brand new in the company, you maybe have an onboarding process already. You can just attach some processes and add some material, training materials here. But onboarding is also about someone is new just to Microsoft Teams. He's working in the company for more than 20 years, for example, and you just have to ensure he can use Microsoft Teams as well. So you have to think about some different kinds of training. Does it make sense to have a hands-on lab, have a hands-on training? Is it a good way to provide some offline material, classroom trainings, or whatever it is? It really depends on the company you're in, because every company is different from the way how they work. You just have to think about what's the best for the current services and products and add them and adapt them for onboarding. I've mentioned it before. If you talk about life cycle, and so team is gone, you are finished with the purpose. It's you have to get rid of them. It's the same for users as well. So if you are offboarding a user, it's worth to think about what happens to the Microsoft Teams team in the background. If you just delete the account, who's maybe the owner of a team in the meanwhile? Is there another owner? Do I have another process to implement to ensure all the data will be there? What happens to the OneDrive data in the background? All the shared documents in a direct chat. What about all the stuff which is not on a very first in a very first stage when you just offboard a user and just want to avoid that the user is able to sign in? And also, what about the hardware stuff? Does it make sense to get the headsets back, refurbish them, and provide it to another user? That's also a question we have to think about. One topic which is really, or which is currently really often ignored, is guest users. So most of the users and companies just think about invite users, guest users to the team. But what happens if the person who has invited a guest maybe leaves the company? Is this guest really necessary to still, is it necessary that he is working in the same team anymore? Does it make sense to use the same user, the guest user, in the same team? Or maybe the purpose from the team has changed and you just have another audience over there. What happens when a team exists for more than a couple of months? So if you talk about years, you have to check and verify guest users. You have to clarify who is responsible for the guest user, who has invited them, if you are willing to get rid of guest users in the background. And last but not least, there are some huge differences between Office 365 and cloud services in the direct computer directory to the on-premises world. In an on-premises world, I do have the chance to schedule and plan huge updates on my environment on my own. In the cloud, there's just a short notification. We will do this and this change between this and this date. So plan for this upcoming change. And you have to be aware of that. You have to be in the communication from Microsoft. What's your change? What is the change on your tenant? How does it affect your users? What happens when this new feature will be available? How does it maybe affect my training material if this is a huge change in the background? So you have to implement update and check process to bring all the new features from the cloud to the users and to your environment. Governance. Governance is the best way to bring the business needs and the IT requirements in perfect harmony. That's the idea behind that. Because the most IT departments have some requirements, like I don't want to share anything from my IT stuff, from my data with external guys. And the business said, hey, that's awesome. I just want to spread all my photos from the last project, whiteboard or something like that with external users as well. And if the IT does not enable the users to use the tools they are in control of, the users will get some other tools in place. So they may maybe want to start with Dropbox instead of a controlled OneDrive and SharePoint environment. That's the reason why you have to describe the best set of rules for the good mixture between business and IT requirements. The cloud is accessible from everywhere. So that's the best and the worst stuff behind as a cloud. The best stuff because you can work everywhere. The worst is because you can get access to the data everywhere. So you may have to think about some stuff to implement some security stuff. For example, MFA, multi-factor authentication, which allows the IT to control the access to specific data or to specific areas of my tenant for a specific set of users. If this user is not able to provide the second authentication information, he is maybe not the right user, and you can avoid some really, really bad scenarios where someone else is accessing your data instead of the right users. Data loss prevention and encryption is a huge topic because in most of the cases, you're able to achieve security for all your current users, but what happens to the data when someone is leaving the company? You have to think about, is it necessary to encrypt the data? Is it necessary to ensure the data are not available anymore when you are someone leaves the company? And of course, you have to ensure that misconfiguration from a user, which was not planned maybe not planned to expose some data from your site to the public internet or to some private users, other companies or whatever. You have to maybe create a set of rules for the data loss. So data loss prevention and encryption are the very, very complex scenarios. Just don't enable it right away. Think about them, create and identify the scenarios you're looking into, and specify also the requirements from your IT and security department about different data types. Not every data has to be encrypted. Not every data has to be identified from a data loss prevention policy. So it maybe makes sense to use categories, something like public, internal, restricted, and confidential or highly confidential data. It's a pretty common text to identify data, and use some rules in the background to encrypt those data automatically. There are some challenges when you're working on premises only and start to work in the cloud. So one of the most common and obvious changes are the role model is maybe different as your current one. That is for job roles. For example, someone is responsible for all the Active Directory data only. Someone is responsible for the security stuff only. But in cloud, they have also be aware of some settings in Exchange instead of just think about a very specific parameter or something like that. For example, firewall settings. Also for administrative roles, there are some differences between the current one, and as an example is Exchange on premises or email on premises, where some onboarding and offboarding task has to be done in Active Directory as well. Office 365 synchronization, groups synchronization is maybe important for you, maybe not. But in most cases, the way how the cloud works is in the most companies completely different as the current company structure is. For example, you have a HR department which is responsible for all the HR stuff, and the IT is responsible for just let the users work with Office Pro Plus or whatever, SAP in the background. And now there are some projects in the cloud where a new SAP version or a new CRM tool should be implemented, and some of your HR guys has to be in the project as well as the IT guys. So the team is spread over different departments, but in the same time, the department is the company is not on the same way to, or is not in the same structure as the cloud currently works. So another challenge is there's remote work only. So most administrators are not a huge friend of using PowerShell, or they have used so many PowerShell that they are not willing to use anything else. They have to rethink how they work. I have to connect to the cloud, maybe use multi-factor authentication. I have to be aware of some very unique commands for the cloud. Sometimes the commands are pretty much the same, which is more confusing in some cases. So they have to really be aware of how they work, how they get access to all the data, and how to ensure that only the right person is able to do the administrative task in the background. You have to be aware of so many technologies in the cloud. When you think about Microsoft Teams, there are so many tools in the background, and in the most cases, you have to train all the tools in different levels over the whole company. So someone from IT has to be aware of all the tools as well as a secretary, which is currently working just on Word, Excel, PowerPoint. So that is a change in the background when you enable, for example, Microsoft Teams. A user is able to use Planner as well. And if they use Planner, they have to be aware how they should use it and what happens to them when they use Planner, how to assign tasks, how to track tasks, and so on. So you have to train a much wider range over there. And with any product in the Office 365 suite, there is a huge change from the mindset within a company. When you start to use the cloud for all the business needs you have, then you change the way how the users will work together. Sometimes they just work in the same office and use some cloud products, but very often there's a need to work remotely on the same stuff, to collaborate on a much wider range with other locations as well in the background. And the users often request some changes way faster than the company is able to implement them. Or, which is is also not a good way to implement it, just C-level is thinking about, hey, new work should be the way we will work in the future. And the users are not able to adapt because the training is missing or something like that. So these are the challenges you have to be aware of and you have to think of before you start to just roll out Teams or the cloud product itself. And we've heard so many sessions about telephony. Yes, you have to think about the technology in the background, but also about devices. Is the current user able to and willing to use a headset, for example? Are there any concerns about the usage of headsets, wireless headsets? There are some users which are have some concerns about using wireless headsets. Some users are not willing to use a headset anyway. They just request a desk phone. For example, you have to think about common area phone scenarios like an emergency telephone in the office. And you have to think about so many different types of devices. Also for the users, but for receptionists or very specific groups of users as well. So devices should be able to work with call queues and auto attendants. Auto attendants are pretty straightforward from an administrative perspective, but from the call flow and organization perspective, there are some challenges about call queues and auto attendants. So who's responsible for which call queue, what happens when a call will be dropped, what happens if no one is in the office, something like that has to be planned and has to be specified in the very beginning of a project. So it's also something that an admin can maybe help with, because an admin is not aware of all these requirements. So the IT has to talk to the business and talk to them. Hey, please explain us how you work and what should happen when someone dials into this specific number. When you start to think about telephony, we have heard there are some ways to use Microsoft Teams for telephony, and in some cases, it maybe makes sense to resync your current telephony provider. So Martin explained there are a couple of countries where it's possible to migrate the telephone number into the cloud, Microsoft Cloud, directly. In some, it's not possible, but it's maybe an idea to change the provider as well. So if you have multiple number ranges, it's maybe the best time to consolidate all the number ranges and have some rerouting in the backend from the provider side. So you have to think about the number migration and well, how does it affect my business? For incoming, outgoing calls, what about call queues? Is there any public service number which is currently in use and we have to be very careful to migrate? Something like that should be on your plan as well. And as Martin mentioned before, there are a couple of ways to connect telephony to the cloud. One is via SBC, one is to migrate the numbers directly into the cloud. So you have to think what's the best way to connect my business, my company to Microsoft Teams for telephony as well. Does it make sense to implement an SBC, or do we already have some SBCs? How do we get to connect to the cloud anyway? The previous session was about call quality and network stuff. So it's really important to think about the current connection to the internet. The example with a centralized internet breakout was very good for larger companies, and it's pretty common for them as well. So you have to rethink, does it make sense to use this routing and this on the same way as the on-premises stuff did before? Does it maybe make sense to migrate some computers or applications to Azure as well? Can I use some workloads in the cloud which are currently on premises? And does it maybe make sense to use an express route in the background, or which provider is connected to Microsoft directly? And all the stuff is really, really important for the idea behind to connect to the cloud. And the most popular issue is most of the companies use a proxy server, which is pretty bad for audio. And the best cases, you can get rid of the proxy server anyway. In the worst cases, you may have to find some exceptions, also from a routing perspective, to avoid the traffic will go through the proxy server instead of a direct internet connection. Last but not least, you have to be aware of any on-premises dependencies you rely on, because in the larger companies, you really often have some stuff like an elevator telephone for emergencies calls. You have some maybe remote locations which are currently use fax for contract stuff, or you have some door openers which are not able to implement in Teams directly. There are solutions for them. And in most of these cases, you can use an SBC or a gateway on site, on premises. But you have to be aware of them, and you have to have an idea how to solve this problem and get those devices involved as well. That's it from my side. Thank you very much for joining the session. And I hope you will join the next one as well.